The man Evelyn Harper buried 6 months ago was standing in the cereal aisle, comparing prices on corn flakes like he had never died at all. At 67, Evelyn had learned that grief changed the speed of time. Some mornings it moved like cold syrup, thick and stubborn, dragging every breath behind it. Other days it disappeared so fast she would look up from her kitchen table and realize the sun had already slipped behind the maple tree in her backyard. Since Thomas's funeral, she had been living between those two kinds of days, trying to build a smaller life inside a house that still felt arranged around his absence. His slippers were gone, his old coffee mug was packed away in a cabinet she never opened, and the side of the bed where he used to sleep stayed perfectly smooth every morning, untouched and almost formal. Friends from church had told her she was strong. Her son had said she was handling things better than most people would. The neighbors still waved with that careful softness people use around widows, as if normal words might bruise them. Evelyn thanked them all and kept moving. She paid the bills, watered the hydrangeas, drove to the grocery store every Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, and told herself that survival was not the same thing as healing, but it counted for something. The day she saw him, she had gone out for milk, wheat bread, paper towels, and the tea bags she liked on quiet evenings. Nothing about the trip was supposed to be memorable. The parking lot was half full. A shopping cart rolled loose near the cart return. Somewhere near produce, a toddler was crying because his mother would not buy him cookies before dinner. It was the kind of ordinary day people forget before it is even over. Evelyn turned into aisle 7, glancing at her list, and then she saw a man in a navy jacket reaching toward the top shelf. At first it was only the posture that caught her attention, the slight lean in his shoulders, the way he shifted his weight onto one foot when stretching for something. Her chest tightened before her mind could explain why. Then he lowered his arm, turned a little, and the world seemed to stop in place around her. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A cartwheel squeaked. Somewhere behind her. And there he was. Thomas. The same silver hair at the temples. The same long fingers. The same profile she had stared at in old photographs after the funeral when the silence in her house became too loud to bear. For one impossible second, Evelyn thought grief had finally broken something inside her. Maybe this was what people meant when they spoke about denial, about seeing the dead in crowds because love refused to let go. But then Thomas glanced up, and his eyes met hers with something far too real to be memory. It was not confusion. It was not tenderness. It was fear. The box in his hand slipped against the shelf. His mouth parted. And in that instant, Evelyn understood the one truth more devastating than widowhood itself: Thomas Harper had not come back from the dead. He had never been dead at all. Thomas did not speak. He did not smile, did not wave, did not even pretend there was some harmless explanation waiting just beyond the shock in his face. He simply turned and walked away fast, one hand leaving the cart behind as if groceries no longer belonged to the life he had been living a moment earlier. Evelyn stood frozen for half a breath, feeling every sound in the store sharpen around her. The hum of the refrigerator cases, the soft music drifting through the ceiling speakers, the rustle of cereal boxes as a teenager stocked a lower shelf. All of it felt painfully ordinary, and that was what made the moment so unbearable. If the world had shattered around her, it might have made sense. But nothing shattered. A woman at the end of the aisle compared soup labels. A cashier laughed near the front registers. Someone pushed a cart past with a baby strapped into the seat. The day kept moving, and Evelyn realized that if she stayed still for even one more second, Thomas would disappear again. So she reached for her cart, left it where it stood, and followed him. He moved quickly but not like a man trained for escape. He moved like someone who had spent months believing he would never have to answer for anything. Evelyn kept several yards behind him, steady and silent, her sensible flats making almost no sound against the polished floor. She watched him pass frozen foods, turn toward the pharmacy, then head for the side exit near the floral display. The sight of him pausing beside buckets of yellow tulips almost made her dizzy. Thomas used to bring tulips home every April because he knew she loved them more than roses. For one dangerous instant, memory tried to soften her. Then he glanced over his shoulder again, and the panic in his face reminded her that whatever marriage she had mourned, whatever kindness she had once defended, the man in front of her had chosen deception over decency. By the time Evelyn stepped through the automatic doors, the late afternoon sun hit her eyes in a hard sheet of light. Thomas was already halfway across the parking lot, heading toward a dark sedan parked near the edge where the asphalt met a line of scraggly hedges. He opened the driver's side door, hesitated, and looked back one more time. Their eyes locked across several rows of cars. Evelyn did not call out his name. She did not beg for answers. She let him see her standing there, straight-backed, one hand resting lightly against the strap of her purse, like a woman who had finally woken from a long and humiliating dream. Thomas got into the car and pulled out too fast, tires scraping slightly as he turned. Evelyn did the only thing grief had taught her to do well. She paid attention. She memorized the license plate. She noticed the faded motel key tag hanging from his ignition. She saw a stack of fast food napkins on the passenger seat and a men's jacket tossed in the back that was not one she had ever bought him. And when the sedan disappeared onto Maple Avenue, Evelyn did not feel faint anymore. She felt cold, clear, and newly alive. By the time she got back to her own car, one truth had settled into her bones with frightening certainty. Thomas had spent 6 months hiding from the woman he thought he had left broken. He had no idea he had just given her the first thread that would unravel everything. Evelyn did not drive home right away. She sat in her car with both hands on the steering wheel, the grocery list still folded in her purse, and repeated the license plate number until it no longer felt like panic and started to feel like evidence. In the 6 months since the funeral, she had forced herself to accept many things she had never imagined surviving. The silence at dinner. The unopened mail addressed to Thomas. The sympathy cards that kept arriving long after the casserole stopped. But this was different. Grief asked a person to endure loss. Betrayal asked a person to question every memory that came before it. By the time Evelyn pulled out of the parking lot, the first raw shock had settled into something steadier and far more dangerous. She was thinking clearly now. Maple Avenue ran toward the older part of town, where the highway cut past a line of budget motels, gas stations, and tired storefronts with sun-faded signs. Thomas had not turned toward any place connected to the life he used to share with her. He had driven toward a temporary life, the kind people chose when they did not want to leave traces. Evelyn kept 3 car lengths back, close enough not to lose him and far enough not to be noticed if he checked his mirror. The farther she followed, the less frightened she felt. In its place came a strange, almost humiliating calm. She had spent half a year believing she was the one left behind. Yet Thomas was the one living like a man with no permanent address, no proper home, and no peace. He turned into the parking lot of a roadside motel called Pinecrest Inn, the sort of place with outdoor hallways, chipped green paint, and a blinking vacancy sign that looked older than the building itself. Evelyn drove past the entrance first, then circled back and parked near a laundromat across the street where she had a clear view without standing out. From there she watched Thomas step out of the sedan and glance around before heading toward room 12. He used a key card, disappeared inside, then came back out less than a minute later to grab a duffel bag from the back seat. Evelyn lowered herself in her seat, but he never looked her way. He moved with the tense efficiency of someone who had been hiding for a long time and was tired of it. When he went inside again, Evelyn took out a pen from her glove compartment and wrote everything she had seen on the back of an old receipt. License plate. Motel name. Room 12. Dark sedan. Navy. Jacket. She underlined the room number twice. Then she sat there longer than she meant to, staring at the door, waiting for some impossible explanation to arrive on its own. None came. No doctor rushing out to say there had been a mistake. No relative calling to reveal a misunderstanding. Only the low drone of traffic and the neon flicker of the motel sign as daylight thinned into evening. Finally, a woman in her 40s stepped out of room 12 carrying a plastic bag from the ice machine. She wore leggings, white sneakers, and a face that had grown comfortable with secrecy. She was not glamorous. She was not mysterious. She was ordinary, and for some reason that hurt Evelyn more than anything else. Thomas had not abandoned one life for some grand reason. He had traded honesty for convenience. Sitting there with the cooling air of early evening pressing against her windshield, Evelyn understood that whatever came next could not be guided by heartbreak alone. Heartbreak had buried her once already. This time she would need facts, names, paperwork, and patience. She started the car, pulled away from the curb, and headed home with one hard truth taking shape beside her all the way back. Tomorrow, she would begin with the documents Thomas had always assumed she would never think to question. The next morning, Evelyn woke before sunrise with the same strange clarity that had carried her home from the motel. For the first time since the funeral, she did not lie in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for grief to settle on her chest like a weight she had no choice but to carry. She got up with purpose. She made coffee, tied back her silver hair, and pulled a banker's box from the hall closet where she had stored every paper connected to Thomas's death because she had not been able to throw any of it away. Until now, she had believed those papers represented sorrow. That morning, they became evidence. She spread everything across the dining room table in neat rows. The death certificate. The funeral home invoice. The sympathy cards. The hospital billing summary. The life insurance correspondence. At first glance, it all looked ordinary, official, and heartbreakingly final. But Evelyn had spent 32 years balancing household budgets, catching errors on bank statements, and noticing when numbers did not belong where they were supposed to be. She had learned long ago that lies were rarely bold at the beginning. They started small, hidden inside details most people skimmed past because they trusted the paper more than their own instincts. She began with the hospital summary. Thomas had supposedly died after a brief medical emergency during an out-of-town work trip. That had been the story delivered to her in a careful voice over the phone by a woman who introduced herself as a hospital administrator. Evelyn remembered how dazed she had been then, how impossible it had felt to ask the right questions while the ground seemed to vanish under her feet. Now, with the pages laid out in daylight, she saw what grief had concealed. The hospital name appeared in one font on the billing summary and another on the attached notice. The address line on the death certificate used an abbreviated county name, while the other documents spelled it out. On their own, those details meant little. Together, they scraped at her memory. Evelyn stood, went to the kitchen drawer, and found the small envelope where she kept old receipts and appointment cards from Thomas's last weeks at home. She compared the handwriting on one of the forms to the signature on a release document included in the funeral packet. It was supposed to be Thomas's signature. It looked close, but not close enough. The loops were tighter. The pressure of the pen was different. Whoever had signed it had copied his name, but not the way his hand naturally moved. Evelyn sat back down slowly, staring at the page until her coffee went cold. Then she reached for the life insurance letter. Months earlier, she had accepted the denial with numb disbelief because the company claimed the policy had lapsed after a missed premium. At the time, she had blamed herself for not knowing more about the automatic payments Thomas used to manage. Now she saw the date of cancellation and felt the room go still around her. The policy had been cancelled 3 weeks before his supposed death. Not afterward. Before. Thomas had not only arranged to vanish. He had made sure there would be no insurance payout to trigger deeper scrutiny, no large sum of money to keep her asking questions. He had designed the entire thing to leave her grieving, confused, and financially cautious enough to stay quiet. Evelyn lowered the letter and looked out the dining room window at the quiet street beyond her front yard. A neighbor was walking a golden retriever. A school bus stopped at the corner. The world outside remained perfectly normal, but inside that house, the last fragile pieces of her old life were rearranging themselves into a pattern she could no longer deny. Thomas had not merely disappeared. He had planned his disappearance with the confidence of a man who believed his wife would spend the rest of her life mourning him instead of investigating him. Evelyn placed the forged signature beside the cancelled insurance letter and reached for her phone. There was one person in town who had handled enough wills, deeds, and probate disputes to recognize fraud when he saw it. And before the morning was over, Evelyn intended to put those papers in front of him and begin the part of this story Thomas had never prepared for. Evelyn had known Richard Bell for nearly 20 years, long enough to trust the silence between his questions. He was a local attorney with a narrow office above the hardware store on Main Street, the kind of man who still wore pressed shirts even in July and kept legal pads stacked in perfect squares on his desk. When she called, he heard something in her voice that made him clear half an hour before lunch and tell his assistant to hold his calls. Evelyn arrived carrying the banker's box in both hands, not because it was heavy, but because she did not trust herself to carry this much truth loosely. Richard motioned her into the chair across from him and waited while she laid the papers out one by one. He did not interrupt when she described the grocery store, the motel, the forged signature, or the insurance cancellation. He only listened, hands folded, his expression turning more serious with each new detail. By the time she finished, the office felt very still. Richard reached for the forged release form first. He compared it to the signature on an old property tax record she had brought almost by instinct, and his jaw tightened. Then he checked the dates on the insurance cancellation letter and looked back at her with a kind of professional restraint that did not fully hide his alarm. He told her that proving fraud would require more than suspicion, but suspicion was no longer what she had. She had a pattern. She had inconsistencies in official documents, a cancelled policy timed before the supposed death, and direct visual confirmation that Thomas was alive and hiding under an assumed story. Richard asked one question that landed harder than any of the others. Had anyone else been unusually involved in the funeral arrangements or the paperwork after Thomas died? Evelyn thought about it carefully and then said the name that had only recently begun to trouble her in a new way. Marlene Pierce. Thomas had worked with her years ago at a regional supply company. Evelyn remembered her as polished, too friendly, and always faintly amused by things that were not actually funny. After the funeral, Marlene had been the one to call twice in the first week to check on her. At the time, Evelyn had thought it was kindness. Now she remembered something else. Marlene had also been the one who recommended the out-of-town funeral home, saying they had handled a distant relative of hers and were discreet and efficient. Richard wrote the name down without comment. Then he asked for permission to make a few quiet calls before anything became formal. He wanted to verify whether the hospital employee named in the paperwork actually existed, whether the funeral home had proper records on file, and whether Thomas had triggered any recent financial activity under his social security number or on jointly held accounts. Evelyn agreed immediately. She had not come there for sympathy. She had come for movement. Richard told her something else before she left. Do not confront Thomas. Do not contact Marlene. Do not tell family or friends yet. People who think they are safe make mistakes. People who feel cornered become careful. Evelyn understood. For 6 months, Thomas had believed he had designed the perfect exit. Let him keep believing that a little longer. Back at home, she found it impossible to sit still, so she did what she always did when life became too large to hold at once. She cleaned. She wiped the kitchen counters, folded towels, watered the fern on the back porch, and checked the mailbox as if any of those tasks could return her to the woman she had been a week earlier. They could not. By late afternoon, Richard called. His voice was calm, but there was an edge under it now. The hospital address on the billing summary belonged to a medical office building, not a hospital. The administrator listed on the paperwork had no state license and no employee record that he could find. And the funeral home had accepted a transfer packet from a third-party courier rather than directly from a medical facility. Everything about Thomas's disappearance had been arranged to look official from a distance and collapse under close attention. Evelyn stood at her kitchen counter with the phone pressed to her ear and felt something inside her settle into place. The pain was still there, sharp and humiliating, but now it had structure. Now it had names, dates, and signatures. Richard said he would keep digging, but one sentence stayed with her long after the call ended. This was never a grieving widow's misunderstanding. This was a planned deception. Evelyn set the phone down and looked around the kitchen Thomas had once walked through as if he belonged there forever. Then she opened the drawer where she kept a spare notebook, wrote Marlene Pierce across the top of a clean page, and understood that the lie was larger than one man pretending to be dead. It had taken at least one other person to help bury the truth. That night, Evelyn did not sleep much, but it was not grief keeping her awake anymore. It was memory, reorganizing itself with cruel precision. Once suspicion had a name, old moments began stepping out of the shadows where she had left them. Marlene's 2 phone calls after the funeral. Thomas insisting, months before his supposed death, that he needed more privacy with the household finances because online banking had become too confusing for her. A weekend trip he claimed was for work training in Cincinnati, even though he came home with no folder, no name badge, and no story worth repeating. At the time, Evelyn had dismissed each detail because marriage taught people to smooth over what did not fit. Love, especially after decades, often looked less like passion and more like habit mixed with mercy. She had mistaken that mercy for loyalty. By Wednesday afternoon, Richard called again with more than suspicion and less than a final answer, which meant they were close to something real. He had located recent activity linked to one of the old joint accounts Thomas had promised he closed years ago. The balance was small, just under $4,000, but that was not the point. The account had been dormant for almost 5 years and then showed 3 purchases in the last 2 months. Gas. A chain pharmacy. A grocery store on the far side of town. Thomas had not vanished into some distant life with a new identity and a polished plan. He was living close enough to use familiar roads and familiar stores, trusting that a widow would move through the world with her eyes lowered. Richard also found that Marlene Pierce had recently signed a 12-month lease on a small apartment less than 10 miles from the Pinecrest Inn, despite having listed a different mailing address for years. Nothing illegal on its face, he told her, but the timing mattered. Everything about this arrangement looked improvised after the initial deception, as if Thomas and Marlene had planned the disappearance carefully and then discovered that real life was messier than fantasy. Evelyn thanked him, hung up, and sat alone at her kitchen table with the late sun slanting across the floorboards. She thought she might cry then, not because she missed Thomas, but because she finally understood the scale of his contempt. He had not left to start over because life with her had become unbearable. He had left because he wanted freedom without consequence, escape without explanation, and control without accountability. He wanted the comfort of being mourned and the convenience of being gone. And perhaps most insulting of all, he had assumed Evelyn would remain exactly where he left her, diminished by sorrow, too polite to question documents, too old to investigate, too wounded to become dangerous. That was the part she could not forgive. Not the lies, not even the humiliation, but the arrogance. He had built his deception on a belief so cold it now steadied her more than it hurt her. He believed she was finished. By evening, Evelyn drove past Pinecrest Inn again, but this time she did not park across the street. She stayed in motion, just another sedan rolling through the fading light, and saw Thomas standing outside room 12 with a takeout bag in one hand while Marlene leaned against the railing talking into her phone. They looked ordinary in the most disappointing way. No grand romance. No glamorous reinvention. Just 2 aging people in a budget motel parking lot, holding on to a lie that had already begun to rot around the edges. Thomas laughed at something Marlene said, and Evelyn felt the last weak thread of sentiment snap inside her. Whatever tenderness had survived the funeral died right there, under a flickering motel light beside a vending machine that sold warm soda. She kept driving, her hand steady on the wheel, her face composed in the rearview mirror. For the first time since the grocery store, she was not reacting. She was deciding. When she reached home, she opened her notebook and made 2 columns on a fresh page. In one, she wrote every confirmed fact Richard had uncovered. In the other, she wrote every question still unanswered. At the top of the page, above both lists, she wrote a single sentence in careful block letters. He did not come back to life. He came back into reach. And by the time Evelyn set down her pen, she knew the next step would not be following Thomas or studying paperwork from a distance. The next step would be using the law he had tried to outrun and letting it arrive at his door before he ever saw it coming. By Friday morning, Richard had moved from quiet verification to formal preparation, and Evelyn could feel the shape of the trap closing without needing to see every wire. He told her that if Thomas had used false documents, misrepresented a death, and continued financial activity afterward, the matter could no longer be handled like a private marital betrayal. It had crossed into fraud, and fraud had a way of becoming very serious once enough paperwork lined up in the right order. Evelyn listened without interrupting, seated at her dining room table with her notebook open and her reading glasses low on her nose. The house was silent except for the old refrigerator humming in the kitchen and the ticking wall clock Thomas had once insisted was too loud. She had hated that clock for years. Now she found the sound comforting. It reminded her that time was moving in only one direction, and for once it was not leaving her behind. Richard had arranged a meeting that afternoon with an investigator from the county office, a careful woman named Denise Holloway who had spent most of her career untangling cases where people assumed paper trails could be made to disappear. Denise was not dramatic. She did not gasp when Evelyn explained that she had seen her husband alive. She only asked precise questions, wrote in neat block letters, and requested copies of every document Evelyn had brought. When she reached the forged release form, she paused a fraction longer than she had on the others. When she heard Marlene Pierce's name, she wrote that down too. By the end of the meeting, she told Evelyn there was enough to justify immediate review, especially if Thomas had continued using accounts, identification, or benefits tied to a fraudulent death record. The words were plain, but their effect was not. 4 months Evelyn had lived inside a private wound. Now that wound had entered the public record. On the drive home, she expected to feel shaken. Instead she felt strangely settled, as if the burden had shifted from her chest onto paper where other hands could finally carry some of the weight. That evening, Richard called one last time with a detail that changed the tempo of everything. Denise had confirmed that a formal contact attempt would likely happen within the next day or two, and if Thomas panicked, he might try to run. Evelyn stood very still in her kitchen, one hand resting on the counter beside a bowl of peaches she had forgotten to put away. She asked the only question that mattered. Would Thomas know she was the one who started it? Richard answered honestly. Eventually, yes. But not before the first knock landed at his door. After the call, Evelyn walked through the rooms of her house with the calm focus of someone preparing for weather. She watered the hydrangeas again, folded a sweater left over the arm of a chair, and put the banker's box back in the hall closet even though she knew she might need it soon. She did not do these things because they were necessary. She did them because she wanted Thomas, wherever he was that night, to have no idea how composed she had become. She imagined him at Pinecrest Inn, perhaps eating takeout at the edge of the bed, still believing he was managing a problem rather than standing at the edge of consequences. Perhaps Marlene was telling him they only needed a little more time. Perhaps he was still comforting himself with the thought that Evelyn would be too heartbroken, too embarrassed, or too gentle to force the truth into daylight. That belief was about to become his last serious mistake. When darkness settled outside and the windows turned reflective, Evelyn caught sight of herself moving through the living room and paused. She looked older than she had a week earlier, but not weaker. Her face held something sharper now, a firmness grief had not been able to give her. She had spent 6 months being the widow everyone pitied. By this time tomorrow, Thomas Harper might be the one answering questions with nowhere left to hide. Evelyn turned off the lamp beside the sofa, stood for a moment in the quiet, and understood that the next sound to break his false life would not be her voice. It would be an official knock delivered by people he could not charm, evade, or convince that he had simply been misunderstood. The knock came at 9:14 on a gray Saturday morning, just after Thomas had stepped outside room 12 with a paper cup of motel coffee and the careless posture of a man who still believed his life could be managed one excuse at a time. Evelyn was not there to watch it happen, but by then she no longer needed to see every moment with her own eyes to understand their weight. Richard had asked her to stay home, and for once she listened. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her, the curtains half open, the house quiet enough that she could hear the ticking wall clock and the soft rattle of wind against the back porch screen. At 9:26, the phone rang. Richard did not waste words. Officials had arrived at Pinecrest Inn, requested identification, and asked Thomas several direct questions he could not answer cleanly. Marlene had stepped into the hallway and attempted to explain that there had been a misunderstanding involving private medical matters and old paperwork, but the explanation had folded almost immediately under basic verification. Thomas, according to Richard, had looked less like a man wrongfully accused and more like someone watching his own reflection disappear. Evelyn closed her eyes and pictured him there beneath the faded motel eaves, still wearing confidence like an old coat that no longer fit. Richard told her the room had been searched with proper authorization. Documents were recovered. Multiple names appeared on receipts and reservation records. A second prepaid phone was found. There were printed forms, photocopies of identification, and notes that suggested the false death had not been a single desperate decision but part of a plan that took shape over weeks, perhaps months. Hearing that should have broken something in Evelyn all over again. Instead, it confirmed what her heart had already accepted. Thomas had not stumbled into a lie. He had organized one. By late morning, Denise Holloway called personally to thank Evelyn for coming forward when she did. She could not share every detail, but she told Evelyn enough to make the picture unmistakable. Thomas had used false supporting information to reinforce the death record. Marlene had helped coordinate logistics after the funeral, including forwarding calls and handling mail tied to accounts Thomas did not want traced too quickly. There was also evidence that they had been preparing to leave the state once certain loose ends were tied up. Evelyn stood by the kitchen sink while Denise spoke, staring out at her backyard where sunlight had begun to break through the clouds in pale strips across the grass. 6 months of mourning had nearly become the cover story for their next escape. That was the thought that stayed with her longest. Not just that Thomas had lied, but that he had counted on her sorrow to protect him long enough to begin again somewhere else. After the call, Evelyn expected some dramatic release, some collapse or triumph worthy of the humiliation she had endured. None came. What arrived instead was quieter and, in its own way, more powerful. Relief. The kind that does not shout. The kind that settles into the body slowly, replacing confusion with something firmer. Thomas had finally been made to stand inside the truth he built for her. Marlene had been pulled out from behind the polished concern she once wore like perfume. The false life at Pinecrest Inn had not ended in romance or mystery or escape. It had ended under fluorescent daylight, with names checked against records and papers spread across a table by people who cared nothing for excuses. That afternoon, Evelyn drove to the grocery store she had abandoned days earlier. She bought the milk, wheat bread, paper towels, and tea bags. She had first come for, then added a small bunch of yellow tulips without thinking too hard about why. At the register, the young cashier smiled and asked whether she had found everything she needed. Evelyn looked down at the tulips resting across the cart and realized the answer had changed. Not everything, no. But enough. By the time she carried the bags into her kitchen, one final truth had become impossible to ignore. Thomas had spent months trying to erase his old life. In the end, it was the woman he discounted most who brought every hidden piece of it back into the light. By the following week, the town had begun to rearrange its memory of Thomas Harper. For 6 months, people had spoken of him with the careful sadness reserved for the dead. Now they lowered their voices for a different reason. The story was no longer about a husband lost too soon. It was about a man who had staged his own absence and a woman who had uncovered the truth with nothing more dramatic than patience, paperwork, and the refusal to remain fooled. Evelyn did not chase gossip. She did not call neighbors or correct every rumor drifting through church parking lots and grocery lines. She had spent enough energy surviving the lie. She was not about to spend the rest of herself managing how others reacted to it. Instead, she let the facts move where facts always travel fastest in a small town, through legal offices, county records, and the stunned silence of people who realized they had attended a funeral for a man who had been alive all along. Richard handled the formal matters carefully. The false death record began the process of being corrected. Financial accounts connected to the deception were reviewed. Property questions that Thomas had once assumed would remain quietly in his control were pulled into the open where signatures, dates, and obligations could be examined one by one. Evelyn sat through those meetings with a calm that surprised even her. She answered what she was asked, signed what needed signing, and watched the structure of her old marriage collapse into plain administrative language. It was almost absurd in its simplicity. After all the heartbreak, all the humiliation, all the nights she had stared into the dark trying to understand why life had become so empty, the final unraveling came. Down to records, timelines, and names written in black ink across white paper. Thomas had built a false ending. The truth undid him in ordinary office light. Marlene disappeared from town before the month was out, leaving behind a lease she could not explain and a reputation that would follow her farther than any suitcase. Thomas, on the other hand, had nowhere grand to go. There was no elegant reinvention waiting for him, no triumphant new beginning hidden beyond the highway. The life he had tried to preserve through deception had become smaller than the one he abandoned. That knowledge did not make Evelyn happy in the way revenge stories often promise. It made her clear. One Tuesday morning, she stood in her kitchen arranging yellow tulips in a glass vase and realized she had not thought of herself as a widow once all day. The word no longer fit. Widow implied love interrupted by fate. What Thomas had done was not fate. It was choice. And with that realization came a freedom she had not expected. She was no longer living in the shadow of a death. She was stepping out of the wreckage of a fraud. Later that afternoon, she opened the hall closet, took out the banker's box one final time, and sorted what she needed to keep from what she no longer owed the past. Sympathy cards went into one stack. Verified records into another. The funeral program sat in her hands a few seconds longer than the rest. Then she placed it gently in the discard pile. Not out of bitterness, but out of accuracy. It belonged to a story that had never been true. When she closed the box again, the house felt different. Not fuller. Not happier. Just honest. That evening, Evelyn sat on her back porch with a cup of tea as the last light faded over the yard. A breeze moved through the hydrangeas. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked once and then settled. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary peace. She had once believed the cruelest thing Thomas took from her was the marriage she thought they had. But in the end, that was not it. The cruelest thing he took was her trust in her own memory, and the most powerful thing she got back was not revenge, not public sympathy, not even legal correction. It was herself. Thomas Harper had tried to bury the truth and let Evelyn live beside a grave built from paperwork and lies. Instead, she was the one who stood at the end of it all, steady and unhidden, while his deception was carried away piece by piece. And as the porch light glowed behind her and the evening settled into calm, Evelyn understood the final verdict with a certainty deeper than anger. She had not lost her husband 6 months earlier. She had lost an illusion. The woman who uncovered that truth was stronger than the one who had once wept beside a closed casket, and this time there was nothing false left to mourn. IDBS